رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد يقول الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم فاذكروني أذكركم واشكروني ولا تكفرون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Baqarah, فاذكروني أذكركم. So remember me and I shall make mention of you. Or mention me and I shall mention you. واشكروا لي ولا تكفرون. And show gratitude to me and do not be ungrateful. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes an oath, a bond with his servant. He tells us, remember me, make mention of me, and I shall in turn make mention of you. Now, we don't have the time to go into a deep grammatical analysis of this sentence, but in Arabic, this is understood as being a conditional clause. It's as if he says, if you remember me, if you mention me, then I will mention you. And he's as well saying it in the form of a command. Mention me, and I shall mention you. Now, what do we understand from this? Well, we understand from this what the Prophet ﷺ understood from it. We understand from it what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said regarding this himself. There's a narration collected by Imam Muslim, rahimahullah, on the authority of Abi Hurairah, in which the Prophet ﷺ tells us that Allah himself has said, أنا مع عبدي إذا ذكرني وتحركت بي شفتاه. I am with my servant anytime he mentions me and his lips move with my remembrance, with my mention. He says, فإذا ذكرني في نفسه ذكرته في نفسي. If he makes mention of me to himself, then I will make mention of him to myself. وَإِذَا ذَكَرَنِي فِي مَلَإٍ ذَكَرْتُهُ فِي مَلَإٍ خَيْرٍ مِّنْهُمْ. And if he mentions me in a group, I will mention him in a group superior to that group. So we understand from this that when a person remembers Allah, when a person contemplates, or when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala crosses an individual's heart, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in turn makes mention of this person in himself. And when a person mentions Allah to another, Allah will in turn mention that person by name to another who is superior to that company. This is clearly understood from the verse. But there's another more figurative understanding of this verse. And that is that when we look at the companions, radiyallahu anhum, Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, Ibn Mas'ud, when we see how they explain this verse, we see that some of them mention the literal aspect of the verse, which most people understand. And some mention the more figurative element of the meaning of the verse. And that is that some of the companions will explain this verse saying, make mention of me and I shall make mention of you. He says, if a person remembers Allah, Allah will remember him. That's clear. While others will explain this verse, make mention of me and I shall make mention of you. They say, obey me and I shall reward you. Oh, be dutiful to me and I will be there for you. Now, where did they understand this from this verse? That is that the word dhikr in the Quran is roughly synonymous or partially synonymous with the word worship in the Quran. Wherever you see the remembrance of Allah, also what is implied, the worship of Allah. Why is that? Because let's say a person has an opportunity to disobey Allah, but then they choose not to. They refrain from that disobedience for the sake of Allah. What happened for them to refrain from that disobedience? It is the remembrance of Allah. When a person stands to pray, when a person gives his zakah, this is in turn mention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, only it is figurative. It is in his actions, it is in the way he behaves, it is in his character, etc. Any obedience of Allah is considered remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a very broad sense. And so when a person obeys Allah, Allah will reward him. When a person obeys Allah in his times of ease, Allah will protect him in his time of difficulty. And this is another meaning of the verse that the Prophet ﷺ understood and mentioned to the companions in another narration. In Jami' al-Tirmidhi, Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma mentions that he was riding behind the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and one day he said to him, Ya ghulam, young boy, inni u'allimuka kalimat, I'm going to teach you some incredibly grave words, some incredibly grave ideas, things that are very important. He said, Udhkurullah yadhkurk. He said, remember Allah and He shall remember you. He shall make mention of you. He said, Ihfadillah yahfadk. Be mindful of the boundaries of Allah and Allah will be mindful of you. Ihfadillah yahfadk. Ihfadillah tajidhu amamak. If you are in constant vigilance of Allah and you are constantly in the obedience of Allah, you will find Him there in front of you when you need Him most. Ta'arraf ila Allahi fi al-rakha, ya'rifka fi al-shidda. In your times of ease and health and comfort and happiness, obey Allah and He will recognize you in your time of need. This is an important point. Because what really sets a Muslim aside from a non-Muslim? What sets the dutiful aside from the disobedient? What's the difference? The difference is not during difficulty. Because in difficulty, everybody calls on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not difficult at all. That's not particularly special. What is unique is that the dutiful, the pious, remembers Allah in his time of ease and health, when he has the illusion that he does not need. That person, when he is in his most dire of need, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be there to respond for him. We see that Yunus alayhi salam, when he was swallowed by the whale, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, He says, فَلَوْلَا أَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُسَبِّحِينَ لَلَبِثَ فِي بَطْنِهِ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. He says that had Yunus not been of those who made remembrance of Allah, made tasbih of Allah, glorified Allah, then he would have remained in its belly until the day of resurrection. This doesn't mean that when he was in the belly, that he remembered Allah, and for that reason Allah saved him or spared him. No, what's meant here is that had he not been obedient to Allah before the whale, then he would have remained in its belly. Because everyone will remember Allah if he gets swallowed by a whale. I mean, imagine that. Imagine the most staunch atheist gets swallowed by a whale. Would they not call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone without any partners at that point of incredible weakness and fear? Of course. What's intended is that had Yunus alayhi salam not been obedient to Allah before that calamity, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have not delivered him from that calamity once it had set upon him. And so the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam teaches Ibn Abbas, he tells him, تعرف إلى الله في الرخاء يعرفك في الشدة. Remember Allah and be mindful of Allah's boundaries and obedience in your time of ease, and He will recognize you in your time of need. When your prayers ascend to Allah, when you raise your hands to Allah, will He recognize those hands or will He ignore them? It depends on a person's state and a person's relationship prior to his moment of need. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach us that which will benefit us and to benefit us from that which He teaches us. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa jazakumullahu khayran.